All right, our scripture text from this last Sunday was from the 11th chapter of John. It's the story of the death and resurrection of Lazarus. Oops, I gave away the ending, but let's talk about it anyways. I'm going to be picking up at verse 32. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her also crying, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" They replied, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to cry. The Jews said, "See how much he loved him?" But some of them said, "He healed the eyes of the man born blind. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and the stone covered the entrance, and Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "Lord, the smell will be awful. He's been dead 4 days." Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory?" So they removed the stone, and Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me. I say this for the benefit of the crowd standing here so that they will believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus shouted in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied and his face covered with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Well, Amy, in your sermon this past weekend, you were using the term wilderness words quite frequently.
Yes.
And I felt like you used that as a pretty broad concept. And I'm curious if you now, upon preaching the sermon and went back and thought about it, I'd be curious how you would define. You were Webster, and you had to define wilderness words in the dictionary or in writing in the Wikipedia for it. How would you spell that out a little more, that you've had a little distance from the sermon?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for me, even when you were asking that, the first word that comes to my mind is like a barren place, somewhere that we are uncomfortable, maybe that we are afraid. A lot of times we don't expect ourselves to be there, and it is uncomfortable. So all of these kinds of words that are not places that we would long to be. Much of the time we don't go, and I even said in the sermon, we don't go often looking for the wilderness. I mean, we expect that during the season of Lent, to walk through this space and time where we clear out things in our lives to be able to listen to God more, but more broadly than the season of Lent, just barren and dangerous a lot of times.
Yeah, I felt like in your sermon too, you also left space for wilderness words. Could be words of deep truths, but they're the type of truths maybe you earned or got as a result of a struggle. Could you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, so I feel like you could go multiple places in the narrative of the Bible and find that being true. I think about the Israelites in the wilderness. I think about Jesus in the wilderness. Lots of other places where people go out and they are able to hear God, to interact with the Spirit in ways that if you are in the midst of a noisy life, in the midst of a noisy society, that perhaps you might not be able to hear in the same way. And I think about, for us being able to clear out space. The season that we're in, this wilderness, as I said in the sermon, that we are in now, our daily routines are all thrown off, and there is room for silence, unexpectedly for us. But I guess I would encourage people to think about those times where we might feel bored as an opportunity to listen in a way that we might not regularly.
Yeah, it's so interesting that this is happening in the context of Lent. It's in a bizarre way. I hate to say it. It's just so fitting. I saw a church Instagram that shared a page that said, "This is the lentiest Lent that I ever did Lent." I don't know if you've seen that.
When you started talking, I had seen that too. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, it makes me laugh to no end. I think that's really funny. I mean, I think my only, I get that. I feel privileged that I'm in a position where, the worst thing I'm having to endure is just feeling cooped up. That's certainly, I know there were some conversations coming out of India, particularly because of how strong the caste system is playing out in this, is helping people understand their privilege and all of this. Um, I think the one lament for me is just where we just aren't going to be able to celebrate Easter at the end of this Lent in the same way it would have normally been celebrated. That's the one sort of big drawback to me from that, outside of just the horrificness of what we're going through. So I want to key in on the shortest verse in the Bible. And I love that every single different translation tries to put their spin on the ball to just say, oh, we're going to be the one that jazzes up this translation. It begins with the Jesus wept, but we, in the Common English Bible, which we typically use, says Jesus began to cry.
Yes.
So, but you expanded on that and talked about how that should give us hope or give us a sense of peace. And I'm curious if you'd talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting translation from the Common English, because it actually, and I know they're trying to jazz it up, right? But I think it might point us to something too, that he began to cry, and this, I'm giving them a lot of latitude with the translation, but he began to cry, and we've already heard that he was deeply disturbed. So I think that translation actually might point us to Jesus had been internally dealing with the grief, even if that was just a few moments before, a few minutes before, but this image of him beginning to cry, like it welled up within him and he had to let it out. So maybe they're just trying to be a little creative with that translation, but I think it can point us to something there. And then one of the interesting things from last week that I read, and certainly it ended up informing what I ended up preaching about, is from the Harvard Business Review. I don't know if you happened to see this article last week, but the title of it is that discomfort you're feeling is grief. And it is very interesting to think about the stages of grief, about how people are grieving right now in the midst of the situation. It's written by a guy named Scott Baronato. Hope I'm saying that correctly for him. But it is an interview with David Kessler, who actually co-wrote with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross this book on grief and grieving, and walks us through some of the things that we might be experiencing now in this wilderness of the pandemic and everything that we're living through at the moment. And one of the things that he talks about in this interview is anticipatory grief. And maybe that's why that translation from the Common English struck me that way today, because the anticipatory grief, it's not exactly the same as Jesus's experience here, but it's looking towards the future and the unknown, and the grief that we feel of these outcomes that we anticipate, that we look for, that we can imagine. And I think that's really on point for us, because we don't know what the future holds for us. So part of our grief is not even just the pain that people are in now and around us, but the pain that we can imagine might be possible, and holding in those feelings of grief. And I think that's why it's so beautiful that Jesus cries, that he lets it out in this moment.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a incredibly complicated matter now, because this grief happens on so many different levels. Whereas somebody who our grief, if we're sitting in a place where, our anticipatory grief is we're grieving the possibility someone we know would be diagnosed. Whereas there are people in much different situations, particularly healthcare workers in places like New York, that have anticipatory grief of having to intubate people, having to, seeing death, or having to triage, and just these complicated things. And I'm curious. I'm not a trauma expert or anything like that, but I can't imagine us as a society enduring this sort of anticipation long term without it having societal wide effects. society-based trauma. I'm sure there's some research in that, but that's super interesting. One of the things that did strike me is I'm you might have seen these graphs, and I'll try to share one if I think of it, that will show the stages of grief as a circle, as opposed to as a linear instead of a linear progression, because we all understand, if we've ever gone through any sort of grief, it's not a linear thing. We jump back and forth, and sometimes we jump really far ahead and then jump back. And but the one I see in particular is that it's a circle, but it has a bunch of sort of like intertwining arrows showing you jumping around. And I feel like in this case, it's especially true because there's a nebulous nature here. If mourning begins with shock, the question I have is, are we all even shocked? Mm. You know what I mean? Or is the shock coming in much like a like a tsunami that doesn't come in as one big giant wave, but comes in as wave after wave that slowly rises and rises and rises. And I feel like that this is going to be just a cyclical process in nature, which is a really interesting question as leaders within a church to ask, is what can we do within our community to help us process these things? And I'm really glad you brought all of this stuff up, because it is a really interesting thing to consider. Have you spent much time thinking on it beyond what you've just sort of engaged in the sermon?
Yeah. So actually, an interesting thing at near the end of this article, which I hope we can link for folks, he actually, Keller has added on another stage of grief, and that is meaning. And so he got permission from this co-author that he had to add on at this point meaning. And, and that is not to say that, that grief was a good thing. Whatever happened, they brought you to this place of grief as like, oh, now I see this as, something that I'm glad happened, or none of those things. But what meaning can I draw from this experience? And what can I take with me into my life moving forward that I now understand? And I think for us as church leaders, that to have our eye on that even now. What meaning can we draw from these moments that we are going through now, and that we will continue to go through? Because one day this will be behind us. I don't know when that will be, but one day this will be behind us, and we will start to go back to our, quote, normal lives. And it will be a shame if we don't gather meaning from this time. And it will just be a shame if we don't think about these things now, but we also in retrospect, because again, one day this will be over. So to be able to look back might be the place where we see even more meaning in this time, and think about, already in our own community, thinking about the ways that people are coming together for one another, in the way that they are, expanding what their idea of gathering and being a community is about. I mean, we could go on and on with that conversation just from, this point where we are now, but really being able to think about, what is God saying to us in this moment, and who are we called to be in this moment, and what are we called to do?
Yeah, what you're saying right there in terms of that meaning dovetails with something I've seen in some versions of it, where near the end, in between the depression and acceptance phase of that, where they'll put this idea of testing, because I think the way we talk about acceptance is often misleading, because acceptance isn't just something like, oh, okay, I'm okay with it now.
Right.
It involves, conscientious choices, lifestyle changes, and they might be minor. They might even just be attitudinal adjustments. But in between those stages, they've just put testing, and the idea is that you're actually just sort of testing. You're testing what's going to work, and if it doesn't, you sort of stay in depression or the others. And eventually, if you find the thing that works, and you move into acceptance, I feel like that very much relates to what you're talking about, meaning, because really behavior shapes meaning, and meaning shapes behavior, and that's really interesting.
And yeah, and the other thing I would say about all of it is, I think that many people judge their feelings when they're experiencing them. And maybe sometimes that's to hold them off because we don't want to feel sadness, or we don't want to feel anger because it can feel overwhelming if we allow ourselves, to say, I am sad. I am in grief about this situation or in any other situation. But I think there's something to not judging ourselves for the feelings that we have. Like, I in my mind, I can hear people saying, "Oh, I shouldn't feel this way because I get to just be at home," or I shouldn't feel this way because of whatever you put on the end of that sentence. But those feelings of that you shouldn't feel a certain way doesn't make it so. It doesn't take those feelings away. So I think there's something to that as well for folks.
Yeah, and to bring it all the way back to your original point of the translation, Jesus begins to weep. I think that's an interesting sort of path forward for us. Is to me the way you sort of talk through that, it reminds me of my experience as a pastor working with people with funerals, and people do their best to hold things together,
Right.
and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's the strangest little things that's the pebble in the dam that dislodges, and all of a sudden the weeping comes. And to me, as I think of where we are right now, to me the lesson I take away from that is, don't invest so much energy into keeping that pebble there, particularly when dealing with this issue. I mean, it's okay. It is okay to mourn, and now that is difficult, and that's difficult because how does one mourn? Because to me, mourning involves other people. Like we can certainly mourn in private, but I think in terms of communal living, as human beings, we're created for community. Mourning, how do we mourn together? In this sort of way, especially within a culture that does so much performative complaining. What's the difference between me posting something snarky about trying to get work done while my daughter's chasing the cat? There's a qualitative difference between that and saying, I'm just not being able to have physical interaction with people, not being able to have that sort of ebb and flow has just really caused me a great deal of worry and anxiety. It's made me fearful about shaking hands, and it feels so dehumanizing. I mean, that's a whole separate thing, and I think that's something I guess I would just encourage people, have the bravery, particularly when you're in communities of faith that there's a degree of trust, have the bravery to have that sort of honesty with people, honest what one is mourning. Is an interesting liturgical idea to think about in worship. How do we create space for that degree of mourning?
And I tried to very briefly. I talked about lament during the sermon, as this too is a form of worship. Bringing that grief to God, bringing our anger to God. That those things too are part of worship.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I feel like honestly, that's like a sermon series that should be 20 weeks long, and every sermon should be the same, because it's a point that's so important, particularly in, to relate it back to performative culture, performative, everything's wonderful, it's just because of the advent of social media, and particularly things like Instagram, where you can make your life look perfect. It's really hard to be that level of authentic. That's a wonderful reminder. That was a great point. So there's a little line. It's a really interesting, tall, tiny, small little line, and it comes in verse 44. And I'll read it from verse 43 and 44 from the Message. And then he shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And he came out, a cadaver wrapped from head to toe with a kerchief over his face. That's wild imagery there. Came out as a cadaver. But Jesus told everyone there looking, who, and by this point they say Lazarus stinks. He's probably been in there at least 7 days, because he wouldn't have been considered dead for at least 3. Said he was in 4. Jesus told the crowd, "Go unwrap him, let him loose, go unbind him." And you had some really interesting theological thoughts on that passage, Amy. I'd love for you to share those with us.
Yeah, so that was one of the places that, I didn't quite have space and time. And I know you know how that is for the sermons, when you're preparing those, but it is really meaningful. I think there's a lot of meaning that we can draw out of this, because this community has gathered around Lazarus's sisters, Mary and Martha, and the scripture tells us that they are all there mourning as well, that they are in grief. And so they're gathered, and Jesus raises him. Lazarus comes out, and actually Jesus invites them to participate in this moment, that untying of Lazarus. And of course, this miracle has just happened. Lazarus is there. So clearly Jesus could have said, Lazarus, come out, and he was already unbound. The story doesn't go that way. Jesus invites folks to take part. You unbind him. And I think there's something beautiful there about how we participate in the work of God's kingdom here on earth. I see it as an invitation from Jesus to those people who had been mourning and who now, probably in a moment of shock, but would soon be, I think, in a moment of celebration, and they are invited to unbind him. And I wonder how we unbind one another from the things that weigh us down, from the things that hold us back. How can we be there for one another as the people of God, to do that now? Because that's not an invitation just for that moment. That's an invitation for us in this moment, in every moment. How do we uphold? How do we bring life to others?
Yeah, that's such tricky language, because which is what makes the metaphor even more powerful, because one could very easily shift into the savior complex. I'm going to fix you, I'm going to save you thing, which is where this metaphor really works, because it's, they're participating in this act of resurrection from Jesus. He did the heavy lifting there, but they're doing their part. But Lazarus is still kind of like, he's coming out of his own power. He's walking, but he needs assistance sort of to become fully human again.
Right.
And so their act of unbinding him is not a salvific act.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not any sort of act in that regard. It is a loosening, freeing, liberating act. And that boy, that's hard to define in really specific terms, but in terms of poetically, to keep in the back of our minds as we proceed with treating one another with care and trying to create generosity and shalom, that's a wonderful, wonderful image.
Yeah, I thought it was just gorgeous. And, after this, when you get over to chapter 12, there's this abundant life imagery of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus gathered together. So this is the kind of movement that we have from this moment there at the tomb into abundant life. And the community got to participate alongside in that. And I love that. I think it's such an example for, how we can be, how the things that we can do.
So this idea of unbinding Lazarus that we just talked about, I feel like it transitions to something that's very, very interesting, and there's a lot of potential in the church right now for this, is the idea that God, who the infinite source of power, knowledge, all these things, the omniscient one, still asks us to participate in God's act of creation, of restoration, of justice. Somehow God is still asking us to participate. God could set things right, make things right. God could glorify God's self. God could do all of these things, and yet God asks us to participate. In fact, the term people have used, God has asked us to be co-creators, which is why within that language, which is really puts the environmental arguments really into your mind. If we are co-creators, shouldn't we be caring not only just because it's good for us, but because we are performing godly roles in caring for this? But to me, I think what's so interesting now is this, I feel like this period of isolation creates the potential for artistic expression. And to me, it gets back to the word liturgy. Here within a mainline Protestant church, we use the word liturgy all the time. It's a liturgical something. If you want to make something fancy, we can say liturgical cake making, and somehow it becomes a thing that is christened, but it's this word that at its core meaning just means work of the people. And yet we've used it in all these different ways. And my worry is particularly within churches full of professional individuals that hire professionals to do professional Christianing on behalf of the church in terms of worship, that we can end up losing the idea that worship is this collective act that we are doing together. It's not necessarily hiring someone to go out and find the best words written by the best thinkers of all time and the most spiritual prayer, and then we'll feed it back to each other. It's this, what's this thing we are creating together? And I'm curious, Amy, if you've had experience in that, or just what are your thoughts on, from a worship experience, of being a collaborative process, or experiences where you're obviously a liturgy writer that writes prayers and things like that, and it's obviously incredibly meaningful for you. I'd be curious, even maybe if you just talk about that, why is it so meaningful, and do you see that potential in others?
Well, so for me, with writing, I love things to be poetic, because I think that it can move people in a way that just kind of plain talk might not. So, and I also think that it can open us up to hear difficult things sometimes, to hear hard things. If we can get at, well, to bring it back, that word meaning, right? If we can make meaning beautiful in some way, then I think people can be more apt to receive it, and not only just to receive it, but maybe to act on the things that they are feeling called to do. Because I think about the art community, the arts community, seeing a play, I think can have a similar sort of experience. You talked several weeks ago now about these kind of transcendent experiences. And I think liturgy, worship, certainly is one of those things. And we often think of those as gathered times. I think the invitation, the opportunity that we have in this season is to use some of that time that we have in our own homes. If you are an artist or a musician, or you like to craft things, to be able to frame those kinds of things that you are already doing as something that could be liturgy, right? That could be the work of the people, and draw meaning from that for yourself, but also to be able to share that with other people.
Yeah, and why you're you just describe yourself wanting things poetic. I find myself wanting things very. I'm concerned about the sort of like the sum total of all the experiences, and so I don't. This is why, as an individual, I just have so many different interests. I'm highly interested in visual arts, obviously very interested in songwriting, very interested in videography, very interested in the spoken word. And because I guess the word I would use for myself is I am very interested in the atmospherics of worship, as
Yes.
a as a lived experience. Does it feel, I grew up in an immersionist tradition. I was fully dunked under the water when I was 10. That baptizo, fully dunked under the water. I tend to like my worship experiences fully immersive, where it's not just hitting me from one vector. It's hitting me from a lot of vectors, from poetic words to rich images. I had an experience years ago at my previous congregation where we did a worship series, and over the course of 4 or 5 weeks, in all of our services, we had different painters paint live in worship. That at the end of the series had created these beautiful works of art that I believe are probably still in the church to this day. And when they first started doing it, we didn't really tell people why they were doing it. Sometimes there wasn't even a really direct thing. It was just like, it's beautiful, and it's great to see people create. And so I'd love to just encourage people in this time to use this extra free time and not necessarily jump to, how am I going to entertain myself so I don't face the grim reality of what's going on, but more take some moments to intentionally channel that into creation. And I don't want to build a hedge around creation and just say it's purely what we define as the typical arts. God is calling us to co-create in so many areas. It could be starting a new business that treats employees fairly, that gives them equity in the business. It's how one operates as a physician, as a lawyer, as someone who is working in the warehouse, working in the stores, in the service industry. It's like, God is calling us to co-create in all those sorts of things. And I don't know, I think there's a lot of joy in that, because I think that it exemplifies the playfulness of God, even when it's in mourning. And I think this is really an opportunity unlike any other we're likely to ever experience in our lives, to be able to be in a situation like this. And I want us as Christians to take this opportunity to do that. And that's why this situation is just so unique, because our heart is, particularly in our congregation, it's jump out, serve, serve, serve. What's the way we can serve? And we're still invested in doing that, but we also have to admit we're really limited in what we can do with that right now, because for the good of others, we're not interacting. And so I'd really encourage people to use this time for that personal reflection and diving from the deep. And it's going to take nerve, because one, you're just going to have to do it. But two, I encourage people to share it. It's meant to be shared. And that's I just really commend that in this time. I find myself playing more piano. I find myself just sort of being much more playful with all those different tools that I love to use.
Yeah. And so you talked just a second ago about people, just don't just fill your time trying to entertain yourself with things. I would also add to that, don't spend all your time trying to be productive. Those things that you feel like you should be doing when you're sitting at home. And I mean, I'm sitting in my room right now and I see that my slippers are on the floor. Why weren't my slippers put away when I took them off? Those kinds of things, like that kind of crushing feeling of there's something I should be doing right now.
I get that. And to me, it almost works in reverse. It's like I feel normal and good when I'm trying to plow through and get something done. What makes me feel like tired and not knowing what's going on is when I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's the joke my wife and I have had before, and I know others have made, is when you travel to see family over a holiday, you'll find yourself on some of those days in the middle of the day, just yawning your brains out, saying like, why am I so tired? And it's just because you're held in a place where you're not in your own house. You're not doing necessarily your job at that moment. And it changes your chemistry in your brain and puts you in a different place, which is, we should learn to embrace as a good thing. And I mean, I don't know, that's what we are here. We're on an extended holiday with family.
So every week, as part of our show, we take a few minutes to bring things to your attention, things that interest us from the week, recommendations that we have for you. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're serious, sometimes they're just crazy. So during this time, we are also going to be lifting up things to you that make us laugh or things that make us feel good. So Shane, do you want to go first today?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a link, and I'll put it in there, and I believe this is a Vanity Fair article, and it's just about, it is about the 20 best sketches of the last 20 years in sketch comedy. So there's stuff from Mad TV and SNL and the Dave Chappelle show. Just a warning, not all these are kid friendly, particularly some of the Dave Chappelle stuff, which is pretty sharp social commentary. But just a word, but every single one of them is about the funniest thing you've ever seen. But there's one in particular I want to highlight, because it is a Saturday Night Live sketch, and I believe it might be the first ever Saturday Night Live sketch of Debbie Downer, which is a character played by Rachel Dratch, who in the light of it, every situation, she just always comes up with the worst thing to say. And this one, they happen to be in Disney World, and it's got a lot of sort of comedy icons in it. Jimmy Fallon's in it. Amy Poehler's still in it. A couple of the other cast, Chris Parnell and Horatio Sands, and I believe the star is Lindsay Lohan in that one. And it's the first one ever. And apparently what happened is they didn't tell the cast that they were going to insert this like wah, wah noise every time she said the Debbie Downer thing. And what makes it so great is I'm having trouble talking about this without laughing myself, is they can't handle it. This, like the people in the cast literally cannot handle it. And it gets about a minute in before they start losing it. And it is almost reaches to a point where the skit can't function, including Rachel Dratch, who is playing Debbie Downer. It makes me laugh to no end. And it's one of those I just literally like bookmark in YouTube that if I just need to laugh. But the list is 20. It's great. I mean, you will lose 2 hours, particularly if you let YouTube autoplay, start watching these things. But if you just need like a quick hit of something, this list is great. And in particular, that sketch.
Awesome. So my kind of funny one for this week is on Disney Plus. So I know that limits some people, but if you don't have Disney Plus, now's the perfect time to get it.
Okay. SpawnCon.
So there's a show though on Disney Plus called The World According to Jeff Goldblum. Have you seen anything about this? Yeah. So he just picks these kind of areas, some things like jewelry, and then has an entire episode just about jewelry. And he's wearing like just crazy clothes through all of it. And you're like, Jeff Goldblum, you're hilarious. I want to see everything that you do. He has one on coffee, one on pools, RVs. So it's really funny, but you also sometimes get to learn some things as well. So I would commend that to you. The World According to Jeff Goldblum.
Yeah, we've kind of had a Jeff Goldblum renaissance here in recent years where he's sort of, he was hot thinged and went away and then came back and again and went away and it's back and we're all enjoying the glory of it. Other thing I'd recommend to you, I mean, this is funny, but I would just more put it in the like, I feel from time to time we need to expose ourselves to things that just make you go, what on earth is that? And right now is the ultimate time to do this with the ultimate thing that is this. And it is a show on Netflix called Tiger King. And it is the most bananas thing I have ever seen. It what's great about it is if you jump in and watch it right now, because everyone on earth online is talking about it. It's almost hard to be spoiled on it because everything someone says on it is like, what? What? Again, parental warning. This is very blue and very like crazy, but it's one of these things you watch and just think, oh man, I do not know human beings come in this configuration, so check it out. Tiger King on Netflix. If you hate it, I didn't recommend it. The rest of the internet did. So,
so that was actually going to be my second funny recommendation.
Oh no.
It is ludicrous. My husband and I were watching one of the episodes last night and I said, I had no idea these things were going on in the world. It's like, it feels like I have just like the curtain has been pulled back and it's like, what is happening right now?
Yeah, I think we're 3 episodes in, but the documentary people do a very good job of like just sort of teasing out questions and comparisons because kind of the central to it is this main man in Oklahoma named, what's his name? Joe Exotic.
Yes.
And his conflict he has with a woman who runs a cat rescue. And the interesting thing is comparison is, she believes herself to be a person of virtue. And then she reviles him. He reviles her. But really the way they operate, and they demonstrate this very, very well, is they essentially operate in almost the exact same way. And yet she considers herself virtuous. He doesn't consider himself virtuous. He just is him, but he's just Joe Exotic. It's boy, it is a trip. So if you're just looking for like a disorienting hour or two, boy, go for that one. It's wild. So you said that was your funny one. I'm assuming, do you have a good, we've thrown a lot of just chaff out there. So what do we got? Do we have anything good or healthy for people?
Yeah, I do. So, international treasure, Dolly Parton. is going to, on April 2nd, start reading bedtime stories for children. She's going to be doing it live on Facebook. So it's actually part of, I don't know if you know about this, but she has done for years the Imagination Library, where she has, I think it's through 5 or 6 years old. Like when a baby is born, she will send you a book every month of their life until they hit this certain age. My daughter took part in that until she aged out of that several years ago now. But that was such a fun thing to be a part of, and so sweet and caring. And so now during this time, she's going to be going live on Facebook. I think it's at 7 p.m. Don't quote me on the time. You can look it up. But she's just going to be reading stories to children. And I will be checking it out even for me just to see this happening.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. I feel like in Tennessee, we have a special relationship with Dolly. That Imagination Library, I think, rolled out here for a little bit first, and then it became more of a national thing. But she's just a treasure, and that's wonderful. The last thing I'd recommend is kind of in that vein. It is a little silly, but I think it's very wholesome silly. There's a British rugby commentator who has been, obviously he's lost all of his gigs. His sort of specialty is collegiate and international rugby. Well, everything has been canceled. So he's basically, in his estimation, lost 4 to 5 months worth of employment because of all these things. And he has one of these just sort of classic British sporting voices, and so he has taken footage from him just out in the park near his house of, like, one is of 2 dogs chasing each other. The other is a group of ladies walking strollers. The other one is someone walking across the street. And he comments on them with all the bravado of a sportscaster, as though these are obscure sporting events. And it is hilarious.
That's amazing.
And what's interesting is it spawned sort of imitation, as the highest form of flattery is the American broadcaster Joe Buck, who does a lot of NFL and even baseball sports commenting. Thought it was so funny, he started doing it his own, but he put a little spin on it too. He takes requests from people where they submit videos, but he will do it if they donate to charity.
That's
it's
awesome.
An interesting little twist. So I'll put some links down there in the notes to some of this man's Twitter feed, the British commenter, and some of Joe Buck's stuff. But I think it's that's an example of creativity at its best, of just playful silliness that it makes the world a little better place. Well, thank you for joining us for Deep Dive. We'll put all these links. There was a lot this week down there in the notes. And we've had some interesting discussions today. Amy, anything to say before we head out?
Nope.
Well, like us, subscribe to us, share us with your friends, and we will see you back next week on Deep Dive with Shane and Amy. See ya.
Bye-bye.